Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a professional dog photographer. I've been doing professional dog photography for the past 8 years now. And tonight I'm going to share with you my journey into dog photography, some of the pearls of wisdom I picked up along the way. And I'm going to also do a little segue about what I think has really aided me in my career as a dog photographer, and that's mindset. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. And I'm going to talk to you about how to take photographs of dogs, or how we take photographs of dogs. I do sometimes tend to go off on a little bit of a tangent. So, if we go off on one, we'll pick up some extra bits along the way and we'll come back to it. So let's have a look. So this is me and my dog Poppy, and we have recently got another little dog called Lily, who, if you guys were here earlier, you probably saw her on my screen. She's a rescue that we got just about a month ago, so I had to include her in this. I currently shoot with a Sony A7R4. I also have a 5D Mark III that I have used for the majority of my career. And one thing I would say about that camera is you can pick that up for about 300 quid now secondhand. And I still swear by it as an amazing piece of kit. And I think the majority of the work you're going to see in this presentation tonight was taken on that. And I think that that's a real testament to that. You don't need the fanciest, the most expensive gear. You can, you can get secondhand gear, and you can get something that's still really good that might have just aged a little bit. So the things that really influenced me growing up were my parents. They were keen amateur photographers, namely my dad. He was always doing train spotting, always going on adventures to Scotland to take pictures of the landscapes there. And I would always be there with my little plastic red and yellow Fisher-Price camera, taking photographs, mostly of sheep and of frogs, but always kind of following in his footsteps. I did eventually get one of those. Again, it was more like a kind of a throwaway camera, but it was one you held vertically. And you might remember the little flashes you had to put on top, and you had 4 flashes, and that was it. You had those 4 goes, and that was it, done. But that, I love dabbling around in that. And I'd always had a passion for animals, especially dogs. So eventually, after years of nagging, my parents did get me a dog. And that's my first puppy. You can see on my knee there, 10-year-old me, which was a little rescue we got. So something that influenced me massively creatively was the work of Man Ray, who was a photographer that created a lot of work in the 1920s and 1930s. Although it's a world away from the kind of work I produce, I was massively inspired by the emotion in his work, and the way that he mixed media as well. So like this one that's on the screen right here, he'd taken the photograph of the lips and he'd mixed that in with a painting. And the concept of doing that really fascinated me. It drove me to dabble in Photoshop and play around with mixed media. In my work now, I do mix images together occasionally. Most of what you see, it was actually there, but like in the case of this photograph, it's actually put together by a series of photographs. So you can see here, this is the original capture. And then I've got extra bits of leaves around the outside of my frame that I've added together in order to create that photograph. Another huge influence was the work of David LaChapelle. I love the color in his work. I absolutely love the boldness of it, how vibrant it is. And although it looks like it's like, just like a complete splash of color, it is also very considered color. So in this photograph with Courtney Love here, he's using lots of warm reds. And then to contrast with that, he's got the blue in there as the opposite for that. In this one here of Alicia Keys, you've got all the blue and the pink, which just so happen to be my colors as well, and the splash of yellow in there as well. So you've got that triangle of colors again that complement each other really well on the color wheel. And then again with the one of Bjork, you've got the pink swan and the yellow. So I love that juxtaposition of color and the bold brashness of his ideas. And I think you can see a lot of influence of that in my work today. Employ a lot of color and a lot of a very stylized look. Is something I like to create in my work. So when I was growing up, I always thought that photography wasn't a real job. And I think that's something that many of us might have heard or been told at some point in our lives. I was absolutely fascinated by photography, and I really enjoyed, I got my first digital camera in 2000, and I really, really enjoyed taking snaps and then playing around with them in Photoshop. Back then it was like 2000, in 2000 it was around about Photoshop 7 or something like that, pretty old version. But I loved it. And I said to my dad, oh, I'd love a job where I can work in Photoshop. And he was like, well, yeah, Catherine, that's all very well and good, but it's more of a hobby. It's just something, a bit of fun, really. It's not a job. So when I went to college, and I did like the sensible studies like English and psychology. And I also studied photography because I still had an interest in it. But when I went to choose what I was going to do at my degree, I thought, well, photography is not going to necessarily pay the bills. So I'll study something that everybody needs. Everybody needs websites, right? This was in 2004. And, I thought that's going to be the next thing. And yes, we do all need websites. But I found out throughout my first couple of years at uni that I didn't really enjoy building them. And perhaps this wasn't for me. So I took it, and I had always thought I would take a year out and get some work experience in whatever I did anyway. And I did end up doing that and worked in a photography studio. So the summer I was a digital artist for a place called Venture. They do family portraits against a white background, that kind of thing, very big in the noughties. And for the rest of the year, I got a job assisting a fashion photographer called James Nader on his fashion shoots. He also had a landscape, like a fine art prints business that he managed. And on weekends, I would do family portraits and kid pictures and that kind of thing in the studio. So that gave me a real world view of what, how photography could be a job. Like I was like, oh, these are options that I can make this into a career. And that's something I would, whether you're a professional photographer at the moment, or whether you're wanting to become a professional photographer, I think if you're wanting to move your niche, I think if you can get some experience, you can watch somebody else who is already an expert in their field. That will give you so much grounding and so much direction. We have work experienced people and other photographers come on our sessions often and just come and shadow. If you ever want to come and watch our sessions, drop me a line on Instagram. I'm more than happy for you to watch. And for me, that was really valuable to learn photography itself. This wasn't dog photography. This was just sort of photography in general. So I finished up my degree and I kind of geared it towards photography. And then I graduated in 2008 when we had that recession. So getting a job of any kind was quite hard, particularly in the creative field. But I just applied to places that didn't have jobs, basically. And again, that's something, if you want to do something, but the opportunity isn't there, be that a job or be that something you really want to photograph, and there is an invitation to do it, then put yourself out there, say, hey, I think I can do this really well. You need me. And eventually, the more you persist with something, then the chances are, well, something will come up. And again, I think this kind of really ties into having that mindset that I will succeed, which we will come on to later. So I eventually got a job working at Venture as a professional photographer. And that experience was monumental in my career. It really, it compounded what I'd learned as doing the work experience. And it gave me a real world view of how the business of photography worked, as well as learning skills in lighting and really getting more to grips with how my camera worked. Although I must confess, I still feel, looking back at that time, there was still so much that I needed to know. I felt like at that time I knew quite a lot. And I feel like the more I've learned, the more I'm like, whoa, there's so much more to know. So when I was working there, I loved the people that, I loved the content. I loved the people that I photographed. I loved the photography that I enjoyed it. And every time a dog came into the studio, I was like, oh, I'm going to do that session. I would always do the pet sessions. But the people I worked for, I didn't love so much, to be honest. It was quite a toxic working environment. And I soon learned that they didn't really share the same values of me in terms of, it was more very business focused. And whilst it is very important, if you want to make a living from photography, it is important to have your eye on the business and the money side of things. That should never, ever be the sole effort. There should be heart in it. So I kind of thought, well, I'd really like to go it alone, but what do I know? But this idea persisted. And eventually I decided to take the leap, and I went part-time where I was working and became a professional dog photographer. I was building up a client base in this time over sort of the first 3 months of being a professional dog photographer. I was just kind of like dabbling. I was doing exhibitions. I was going to dog shows. I was promoting myself on social media and really just trying to generate work. That was in 2013. So this is some of the work from my first year in business. So you can see there, I'm already like I'm loving the landscapes, the color. You can see that influence in my work starting to happen. Now, I must say, with these photographs, I did re-edit these a couple of years ago. When I looked back at these, they were very, when they were originally edited, they were very heavily saturated. Maybe the contrast was a little bit more than it should have been. And I think you'll find that if you look back through any of your work, you'll soon learn that you know more. And it's great. You should never ever compare yourself to others. You should only ever compare yourself to yourself. So I think it's really healthy to look back over your old work and think, oh wow, well, I could do that a lot better now. What was I thinking? And maybe rejig it, or use that as a sounding board to go forwards in the future. So, oh, hang on. Sorry, I skipped over a slide there. So that then brings us to 2021. This is some of the work in my portfolio now. Again, a very vibrant, very heavily stylized look that has come from that. So I encourage you to have a look back at stuff that you've produced in the past and see how far you've come. And now we have the studio, but I didn't always have that. So go back a couple of slides, and I was it was just me and my camera and my dog, and I was just out there photographing dogs and making the best of what I had. So it's worth, if you have something in mind, it's worth realizing that it takes steps to get there. There was something that my university lecturer said to me that has really stuck with me. And he said, okay, you want to imagine the moon. That's your goal. The moon is your goal. Half that moon, and then half that again. So that first quarter is what you want to go for. That's what you're trying to attain. Because if you're trying to attain that whole moon, you're just going to completely overwhelm yourself. But that first chunk is attainable. And then you can get the next chunk, and then you can get the next half, and so on. So it's building up towards where you want to go. It's great to have direction for where you want to go, but bear in mind that it does take steps. And that's something I'd love to talk to you guys about now, that I think will be helpful not only in photography, but in life in general. And that is mindset. I think it has been key to my success. I think that if we can adopt the right mindset, then that can shift us into the direction that we want to go in. So I would like you all to put your hands up in the air. Okay, put them up in the air. I don't care if you're in the kitchen, in the living room, if your dog's watching, whoever's watching, pop your hands up in the air. All right, and now I want you to put it up even further. Stretch it right up. All right, you can take them down now. So what I want to ask you, what I want you to ask yourself even, is why did you not put your hand up all the way as far as you could the first time? That's because we have a tendency to hold ourselves back. We have this instinctive negative bias that causes us not to put ourselves forwards as much as we possibly can, just in case something happens and adversity calls. So bear with me a sec. All right, so that hadn't always been the case. When we first started out, we, as a happy-go-lucky early human, if we were wandering around and we didn't have this negative bias, then the chances are we weren't going to see danger. We would be just like wandering around the forest, and we wouldn't see that mountain lion disguised and hidden behind the rocks. So we'd get eaten before we could prepare our defense. But if you're an early human who's a little more on the alert side, and you're constantly on the way, maybe you're a little bit stressed, like, oh my gosh, is the mountain lion here? Is the mountain lion there? Then when that mountain lion does make its attack, you're going to be much more likely to survive than your happy-go-lucky counterpart who we met earlier. So this is where it all comes from. It's our need to survive. However, we're not in those prehistoric times now. Our world has massively changed, as has our environment. But we do tend to hang on to those negative thoughts for the simple reason that it helped us survive in the past. And we passed it on down through the years. It does still help us now sometimes, but we don't need it all the time. So this is something that we have to be constantly aware of and mindful of and work very hard to overcome. Something that I see in many photographers across the globe isn't that their work isn't good enough or that they can't improve. And it's that they can't charge highly profitable amounts for their work. It's just that they don't believe that they can. But our brains aren't fixed. In fact, they are very malleable. So we have got the opportunity to redirect our thoughts. If you find that you have any negativity in your thought process, as we've established before, it's not your fault. It can be reprogrammed, but it does take work. And that does come from us to do that, to gear ourselves towards success. So there are two kinds of mindsets that we can choose to adopt. And it is a choice. It's not always an easy choice, but it definitely is a choice. So the first mindset that we can choose is the fixed mindset. With this, you believe that you're either good at something or you're not, and that skills and talent are just something that you're born with. So, for example, a fixed mindset would think, I've never been good at off-camera flash, I'm just not creative or technical enough. Whereas a growth mindset realizes that talent is developed and that skills are learned. So if they fail at something, rather than thinking, oh, I'm just not good at this, they see the opportunity to learn and to grow from that experience. So, for example, a growth mindset would think, I was never good at flash work in the past, but I believe that I can improve my creativity and I can find my own ways to understand the technicalities. So can you see how limiting or opportunity granting those two different mindsets are? I've experienced the benefits of adopting a growth mindset at the very start of my dog photography journey, as I just touched on earlier. By pushing my mindset towards an I can attitude and reaching out into the ether for that, how I allowed my brain to connect the dots. And then in my subconscious, I found the answers. Now, I'm not a spiritual person, but I do subscribe to the idea of spirituality in that if you have a mindset that, so I know, for example, you think, I want to come into some money, and you think in your head, right, I'm going to come into some money. I'm going to come into some money. You might be just walking down the street one day and you spot 2p on the floor and you're like, oh, I've come into some money. So you're connecting those dots and you're finding those opportunities based on what you want to happen. I do feel like when I first started, I was basically winging it. And I still feel like that sometimes now, even though, I do know what I'm doing. There's a lot of stuff that I'm still figuring out. And that's the same for everybody. It's always a learning journey. You should never, ever stop learning. And I've always held on to that attitude that with hard work and perseverance, I can make it happen and I can figure it out. Thanks to my tenacity and can-do attitude, despite only knowing a very small slice of what I know now, I had an incredibly successful first year. I put this down wholly to my unending determination to make it happen and making the decision to take imperfect action over perfect inaction, which is something I harp on about all the time to my laugh. By shifting our thoughts into a positive can-do mindset, our motivation increases. There's always a positive or a negative in absolutely everything that we do. So choose to focus on the positive because you control your thoughts and you will reap the rewards of that conscious shift. We're always going to have setbacks in life. That's a given. But to promote success, and I should put a little side note here as to what I define success is. So I define success as being happy in your life, doing something that makes you happy. That might be being a full-time professional photographer. That might be working full-time and doing photography as a sideline and doing lots of creative work that really fulfills you. You define your own realms of what success is. But I think it is really important that we strive to consider ourselves successful in whatever we do. And that comes from mindset. So whatever setbacks you have, don't let them define you and don't let that define your mindset. I can't stress enough that it is you that defines the way that you think. And I get it that sometimes it takes a lot of work, but please know that you are in the driving seat for achieving your goals, whatever they are. So how do we do that? How can we start? Well, make the best of what's around you. Whatever it is that you would like to hone next. So maybe you want to shift from doing portraiture to doing specifically dog portraiture. Maybe you want to start using flash in your work. Maybe you want to start earning more money or an income at all from your photography. But you can't jump to the end point. You can't be like, right, I want to have a full-time business and be a professional photographer all the time when you're like I was at university and just finishing your degree. So it takes those baby steps. And once I had a few months in business, I actually was lucky enough to have the funds to turn my garage into a home studio. So, okay, I didn't have the studio away from my home, which I would have really liked, but I had this resource that I could use. So just make use of whatever you have. I didn't have this to begin with. So I was just having clients in my home, in my living room, and I would sometimes go to their living room. You can do it out of the boot of the car when it comes to showing them their photographs. You can do it wherever. Something that really redirected the business, my business, was meeting my other half, Michael. And he rebranded our business. So the logo that we had previously was this one just here on my garage door. And he introduced this word mark, CatsDog, and the little icon here, which is based on my dog Poppy's head. That has been really instrumental into what we've done, because I've been able to, he started out doing shoots separately, and we had other staff, which I'll touch on in a minute. But it's worth trying different things. So the original vision we had for how the business was going to work has actually diverted into a slightly different vision. But that's okay. Try, if you think, oh, I want to try doing this, do it. That imperfect action we were talking about before, and you can always redirect. So now, rather than him going off and doing his own shoots and me doing my own shoots, we shoot together. And that has really been key for the way that I produce my work now. This is him assisting me on a shoot. I usually Photoshop him out of these photographs. So this is how the pictures usually look when I'm on a session. And then I'll photograph out human elements, light, etc. But I thought this was quite a good representation of the madness behind the camera. So he'll usually be there with treats or a toy and the light. He's usually holding the lead, to be honest, and managing the dog. And then we'll use our client as a bit of a portable light stand. They'll hold the light and direct it. Wherever we put it, basically. So think about who you've got, who's at your disposal. Who can you drag in if you've got another half or a friend, or perhaps somebody that's really interested in photography and wants to get into it themselves, and they'd love to come along and watch how you roll. That's a really good opportunity for you to have a second pair of hands. We eventually moved the studio from my home studio, my garage, to Tulcove Brow in Preston, where we are now. And this has been really valuable, having that space to show the clients the work. And if you're trying to sell photography, then I really recommend having larger prints. It's easier to go down in size than it is to go up, so that they can really visualize it. Oops, sorry. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what's in the studio here, the desk right here that's like our reception desk, where we used to have staff pre-pandemic, just over here. And then we have a little viewing room through here, which had a TV on the wall, and then a sofa, and the clients could then pick their work. And incidentally, the size of that room was just what my garage was initially. So again, that's an example of having those building blocks of living room to garage, and then essentially having this gallery, which is an extension of that. Our next phase in business was taking on staff. And that was what I envisaged. We were high volume at the time when I started out. We were doing 30 sessions a month, or I was doing 30 sessions a month. I was on my own, which, yes, was quite exhausting, but I was like, I'm doing this. I wasn't going back to where I used to work. And my vision was like, oh, great. Well, we can have more staff and then serve more clients and expand out that way. But then what I found was I was having other photographers go out and shoot all these lovely dogs and go on all these adventures. I was doing some shoots, but then I was editing their work as well. I was then doing the viewing appointments for their work. And I was getting to do less of what I really loved. I was having to manage people. And it wasn't really where my heart was at. I could tell it just wasn't setting my heart on fire. So we redirected a little bit. We still have staff, admin staff, and I have an assistant that books in my sessions and handles clients and that kind of thing for me. But it's just me and Michael that do the shoots now. And rather than us shooting separately, we shoot together. So that vision that I had didn't quite work out. I thought maybe I'd have another studio somewhere, but as I did it, I figured it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And that's okay. It's okay if you go on one road and then you veer off and go somewhere else. It's all part of the journey. Right, we're going to take a little break now. And before we do that, I'm going to share a behind the scenes video of showing some of the photographs that I've being taken, and then the resulting photograph. And then when I come back, I'm going to talk through, I'm going to give you some advice on getting published or getting awards, if that's something that interests you, and how we photograph dogs as well. Bo. I was going to say, we've just had a fabulous session with Bo here. She's been full of beans. So So for this next section, I'm going to go through some of the images in my portfolio and give you a little bit of a detail behind what happened for that photograph to take place. Because as you saw in that video just before, it might look in the final image like they're all posing there perfectly, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Usually people holding on to leads, lights here and everywhere, and other bits that get put in place in order to make it happen. This photograph is actually made up out of several different shots. The original frame is more around here. I was shooting super close to the dogs because I wanted to have the light really close so I could get as much power, because I was competing with the sun behind here, and I wanted it to be softer. And obviously when the light's closer to the subject, you get a softer light. But I also knew I wanted to take in the whole scene. We were at the top of Malham Cove here, which is where Harry Potter's Deathly Hallows was filmed. And we had this glorious, glorious landscape. And I really wanted to take that in the scene as well. So once I'd got my frame of the dogs here, I shot around left and right and a little bit above and below so that I could extend that out into the panoramic that was in my vision. I also, on this original frame, I actually shot it so close that I originally had cut off just the very end of her paws there. But I knew when I was uploading, I knew I had a shot where her paw was in. So I've seen that together in that final photo. And that's something that I think is really worth doing, is keeping hold of all those extra frames. I mean, there's a caveat to that in that you don't want to keep loads of stuff that's obviously like completely out of focus or misshot and you're never going to use. But if there's bits that you think might be useful, then keep them, stack them underneath the original photograph, and then you can build together to get the photograph that you want to create. This little guy is stood in front of the provincial court in Bruges. I think that's what it was anyway, this big courtyard. And we actually met him in a shop. Michael, my other half, had bought a fancy suit in a boutique there. And just after we'd paid, spotted under the desk this little guy. And I was like, oh my God, he's gorgeous. And I knew his colouring would work really well with all the greys in this area that we just walked through here. I don't always match my subjects to their environment intentionally. It's something that you can certainly consider. It depends on the direction of your work. A lot of the stuff that I produce, I think, is down to serendipity, and I'll put things in place and wait for opportunities to arise. But sometimes it is worth thinking, or when you're on a location, if you've seen something, so say you're photographing a yellow Labrador and you spot a bit of yellow sandstone, then think, that would make a really nice kind of like monotone photograph. So you can look out for these things within a scenario, or you can plan it. So like here, I asked the shop owner if we could borrow his dog. And I thought he's going to be like, no way. Like, you strange English girl with the crazy hair, you're not taking my dog off on a little adventure on your own. But he said yes. I couldn't believe it. And we took him out along the street, and I thought, is he going to be nervous? But he was super confident. He just tootled alongside us. And we came up onto the steps. I got down super low so I could take in the building. I was on a really wide, I think it was like a maybe 12 to 24 lens here. So I could take in all the scene. And I had originally, Michael was holding him here, and I took an extra shot. I asked him to move behind me and took an extra frame so that I could lay that over the top and then Photoshop him out. I also tilted my camera up a little bit just so I could get a little bit extra here, because originally the frame cut off around out here, and I wanted to get that full extent of the building going all the way up. This guy you may recognize. He's called Husky Anuko. If you Google Husky Anuko, he will come up as this grumpy husky with like furrowed eyebrows, either with a rose in his mouth for Valentine's Day. He's shot to fame with these photographs on like various viral things. There's a Christmas one where he's looking really cross, and a birthday one with a little birthday hat on. But when he booked in for the session with us, I wanted to portray him as like a happy husky, which is really how he is. And his mum just knows how to get that grumpy face out of him for the photos. And this was actually just taken by a roadside. It was on Beacon Country Park. There's like a little trig point right next to the car park, and the main road's just over here. I thought the bricks looked really cool. The sky was really dramatic. So I got down low and cut out all the busyness behind it. And that was my shot. So even if the landscape, you absolutely, you're not like absolutely like wowed by it, then it doesn't matter. You can use the sky, you can use a telephoto lens and just narrow in on a small area. You can cut out the bits that you want to share. This little guy called Buddy was photographed in Manchester's northern quarter. The grid behind him had these gorgeous textures on them. I hadn't actually been to this spot before we photographed. So sometimes there's some locations we've done a recce at and we tried and tested. And sometimes I'll just look up on Google Maps and figure out, oh, I think that'll work well. I think that'll work well. So if you can't actually get to a place and check it out before you shoot, have a look on maps, have a look at what photographs have been taken there beforehand, and that'll give you some idea of what you can create there. So I'd taken the speed light with me so I could really light up the color behind and create that texture in the riveted grid behind him. And serendipitously, it had actually rained. So this floor was all sparkly and beautiful. If you want to create that wet floor and that sparkly floor and it's not been raining, you can always recreate that by pouring water on the floor and having that nice little sparkle. And then I'm lighting him from the front with, I've got my ProPhoto B2 and a rice bowl modifier on it. So it's much softer. And again, with this, I've shot around to extend the canvas. It's something I do quite a lot in my work. It creates almost a medium format look to it, because if you shoot wide, then and you're close to your subject, then it's going to take in way more. Whereas here I'm at 35 mil, so it's more compressed than if I was at, say, 16 mil. And but I'm still taking in the scene by shooting around and adding those bits in. This is my little darling Poppy amidst the fields in Holland, the tulip fields in Holland. Most of this is just shot as seen, that she wasn't on a lead. She's a very good poser. She's grown up in front of my lens. There are a few tulips, I think, down in the foreground that I've photoshopped in just to fill in any of those more sparse areas, but it was more or less as seen. We're taking a little box with us so that I could bring her above the tulips, because if she was sat on the floor, then her head would only just be around about here. So again, it's worth just thinking about the size of the dog that you're working with, like how high they're going to be, if you're going to need anything to put them up on, if you're going to need anything to restrain them with, etc. Those while on that, actually tie out stakes are really good for that. You can just screw them into the ground, attach the lead to them, and then that anchors them in place. So it's always good to pack something like that in your kit bag. This is probably one of my favorite photographs from last year. It was nominated in the British Photography Awards, and the thing I really love about it is the circular, the patterns there, and then his quizzical face just looking down at me. And this was a Liverpool castle ruins. Now, the ruins aren't original ruins. They're a folly that were built in the 1930s by the guy that did everything at Rivington, and all the follies up there. And when I'd been there originally, we had a session there, and I had taken a photograph of a Labrador originally looking down. I'd looked up and thought, wow, this hole's really cool. That'd be nice framing. But on my first attempt, the Labrador's head was much further forwards. So it was covering up the majority of that hole, and you didn't quite get that same composition that we've got going on here. So if you try something and you think wasn't quite how I envisaged, and you're not quite happy with it, don't be afraid to go back and try your idea again and draw on what you learned from last time. So this was actually, I think somebody had been using this as a male public toilet, because it didn't smell great, to be honest. And I was led belly down in the dirt, as I very often am when I'm photographing dogs. I like to be either, for the most part, either at eye level or beneath them, because they're the hero of the piece. So I'm led down in this questionably smelling, very small, tight space at a strange angle. This was before I had my A7R4, which is mirrorless with the pop-out screen. So while now I have the luxury of being able to look through the viewfinder while it's up here, In this case, I had my 5D Mark III. So I'm down on the floor, like chin up, like getting a bit of a crick in my neck. And then Michael sort of stood over me with the treats. My client's here holding the light, and the other pet parent is holding the leash behind him. So there was an awful lot going on into that tight space. And in fact, if you have a look on my Instagram, there is a reel showing the behind the scenes of this being created. You can see the chaos there. But you know, I feel like that it was worth it. It was worth getting dirty and smelly for, and it was worth going back for. So always bear that in mind. If something doesn't work out the first time, go back and try again. This little girl, Tiffany, is a rescue that we photographed over in Bali just before the pandemic. This was January 2020, the days we could travel. And she was a very wiggly little girl. This photograph isn't actually technically perfect, and I'm usually a stickler for this kind of thing. But in the context of this photograph, I feel like it works because you've got the movement of her paw. You can see there's a little bit of blur here and on her ears, but because of the context of what it is, I have still got that in my portfolio, and it is a photograph that I still like because the eyes are still sharp. I've done some sharpening work on there, and there wasn't quite as much movement in there. So for me, that got a pass for this. It's something that you would get marked down for if you're entering it for an award. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But again, thinking in context, this was for rescue. It's to help her get rehomed. And as a photograph, I still love the character. I love the motion of it. Now, usually when I'm photographing dogs in action, I will be 1,000th of a second plus, ideally. But for the majority of the photographs I'm showing you here, you'll notice that they're at 200th of a second. Now, the reason for that is because a lot of the work that I really love and feel passionately about, I use flash mixed with the ambient light. And in order to get the most power out of the flash, I need to be at 200th of a second or lower than that. So you can shoot with flash above 200th of a second, but then you need to go into high speed sync mode, which then massively reduces the amount of power, because the way that works is your flash is just going flash, flash, flash to be able to keep up with the shutter. And I want, because I'm competing, like here it was absolutely sweltering hot and I'm competing with the sun. So I was super, super conscious that I wanted all the power. So sometimes, there's that little bit of a trade-off. And when you're working with dogs in hot conditions like this, I mean, in this country, it's avoid it if you can, because it's not like it's not always hot. In Bali, it was just hot every day. So we had them in the shade between shots, and then we're just bringing them out very, like, briefly. There's a few dogs we were photographing in order to get our shot. I still have a sunburn scar on my leg from this shoot, by the way. Dying for my art. These gorgeous burners, Penny and Freya, we photographed at Bolton Abbey. Again, I think it was last year as well. And this photograph was taken, like many of the others we've seen, right in here. And then I've shot around up here. So a tool that's really valuable when you're shooting wide angle and you're shooting with door frames is the straighten tool in Lightroom. Have a look at that. I've got a video, actually, my last live that I did on my IGTV. It shows how I use that, how you can straighten elements. And this, it hasn't straightened up perfectly because of the angle I was at and the movement that was happening. There are a few things that are skew with, but it's been straightened up an awful lot from how it was originally. And if you can just get those lines straight in your photograph, more or less, then it gives the photograph a more balanced feel. So she just got completely fed up by the end of this photo. It was the end of the session. We'd done a full couple of hours and she just slumped down. My original idea was actually to have them both stood in front of the door, but the adult dog here, Penny, sat down, and then Freya sat down, led down next to her, and I was like, boom, that's the moment. So when you're creating something and it perhaps changes slightly, but you think that's still good, then hey, don't worry, move on from the original idea you had. Like we were saying earlier on, divert and go down the new path. Work with what you're given. I've got another burner in here. This was one of our clients over in Chicago. We photographed, again, just pre-pandemic. This was October 2019, in the days we could travel the world. And this was taken in my client's garden. She's actually a renowned professional dog photographer herself. So when I went there, I was like, oh my God, no pressure. And her dogs were very different temperaments, pretty wild, like lovely, lovely dogs. But Ping particularly was absolutely fascinated with the chipmunks in her backyard there. yeah, they have chipmunks over there. I was like, chipmunks. It was exciting for me too. And whatever we did with Pink, she was looking at, like here, there, everywhere, just not at the camera, basically. And bear in mind, we also had a puppy and another dog to manage there, Fern. So as I was taking the shot, I noticed out the corner of my eye, this client had a picnic bench just here. And I thought, well, if we put the dogs up on there, that's going to anchor them in place. And what it also does is it brings the dogs to the edge. So all of their eyes are in the same plane of focus. So when you're out, if you see a ledge, a wall, a tree stump, or anything that you can bring them up on, then it's going to hold them in place a little bit easier than if they're just on the ground and feel they can go everywhere. This photograph was taken in Manchester's Northern Quarter again, up against some graffiti that we just passed, actually. We were on the way to another spot, and I was like, wow, the riveted textures of that wall really struck me. Kimber and Zebedee are poolies, very unusual dogs. Their fur actually dreadlocks naturally. Their top knots originally were red, but I just changed them to orange to match this background here. I love how there's these lines going across vertically, and then you also have the horizontal lines. I've said that the wrong way around. The lines going across horizontally in the background, and the lines in their fur going vertically, like crisscrossing over each other. Again, with that one, I've shot up. They were actually really, really good, well-behaved dogs. There was people passing behind us. It's so busy. And you'll find if you ever shoot dogs in the city, it's a much harder environment than if you're somewhere natural where there's not so many distractions. So you really want to be selective on the kind of dogs that you photograph in the city. These guys are city dogs, so they were quite used to it. They were just chill and quite happy to pay attention to me. This gorgeous Akita is on the top an upturned tree root. And I have to credit Michael took this photograph because this was his vision. I've moved it around slightly. When we photograph together, we often confer on the work we're doing. Like I'll discuss a shot and analyze it with them. And feel free to do that, whether you're on your own or whether you're discussing it with somebody. Feel free to just take a minute to be like, oh, hang on, I just want to analyze this and recompose. Like, don't feel, if you're shooting for a client or for a friend or whoever it is, if you're shooting for someone, don't feel the need to apologize for you taking that time just to assess your work and recompose. That's all a part of you being an expert in what you do, in that you're being conscious and intentional in what you're shooting. So we'd use this route to almost otherworldly. You can't really tell what's going on because you've got all these lovely lines going across everywhere. I feel like it's almost Two-Man Studio influenced. Their photographers in America that absolutely adore the work of. They do a lot of wedding photography where they have the subject usually quite small, and there's some really cool like composition. They make great use of negative space. I relate that to that quite a lot. But this has also had some adjustments made with color grading. Something I've really enjoyed playing around with recently, just messing around with the colors and the shadows and the highlights. And if you can pull them to opposite ends of the spectrum, so like warm highlights and cool shadows, and that creates more contrast and richness in your photographs. These three little babies were the goodest dogs you can imagine, not what you'd expect from sighthounds. They were actually off their lead, belonging to another dog photographer, and so good. The original photograph of this is very different because there's none of these roots on the original shot. The original photo was around here, and then I've shot it down here and then down here to extend it out. I remember when I saw this, I actually thought I'd shot it portrait because in my mind I had this vision of it being portrait. But if I'd have shot it portrait and close up, then so I could get that. If I'd have kept it like that, then I'd cut out all these lovely roots. So I've got my original shot, and then I pointed the camera down, shooting it in landscape mode, and then stitched it all together to create that portrait mode style photograph. So again, this environment as well was one of those where we're in the Surrey Hills, but the landscape was just quite bleak. The sky was a bit meh, and there wasn't a lot of interest, but this tree really stood out to me. So look, if you think you haven't got a lot to work with your landscape, look for little bits that you can pull out of that scene. Oh, little Buzz. This was in the Toronto cityscape behind him. Buzz is a Chinese crested hairless breed. So It gets quite cold in Toronto in the winter and autumn months. So he has a ton of little jackets like the one you can see him wearing there to keep him warm. He's got dwarfism, so he's super, super tiny. And he was an excellent model for our shoot. We waited. So for the shot, we waited until the sun was really going down and the city lights came up. There was that small window when there was still a little bit of light in that dusk sky, but then also the lights of the city were coming on. And I was able to include them in the photograph, get that gorgeous bokeh. The reflection in this shot, which in my mind, when I saw it, was beautiful. It was so nice in real life. And in my mind, that's what I wanted to be a part of the photo, all that color. But the reflection came out in camera not quite as impressive. So I've kept that, but then over the top, I've layered like a flipped version of that sky just to enhance the colors there, and played around with the layers there. So take pieces of what's already there and use it to enhance the photograph if it's not quite where you want it to be. This has got to be my all-time favorite photograph, my baby Poppy. And it's probably also one of the most challenging photos I've ever taken. For this, Michael was hung off the edge of the elbow in Amsterdam with the lights and treats in hand, which he was feeding to Poppy. So she was looking towards that light, and we could create that really nice sculpting, almost like Rembrandt effect on her. Poppy isn't the biggest fan of water, so it was also managing her, making sure that she was happy and comfortable, keeping her distracted with treats. When you're photographing any dog, you always want to make sure that they're comfortable and you're not pushing them outside of their comfort zone too much, because A, well, you want to keep the dogs happy, and B, you'll be able to see in their body language if they're not happy. The ears will go back, the eyes will be wide. So it's super, super important to keep them paid. But on this shoot, the boat was moving, so the composition's moving, and like I said, I've got Michael hanging off one side, so it was quite a challenge, but it came out. So I'm going to talk to you next a little bit about getting published, what my experience has been with that, and whether I think it's worth it. So in terms of it being worth it, it's nice being published. It's a bit of kudos behind it, but I don't think that it's the be all and the end all. So I don't think that you should place so much value on it that you think, oh, my work hasn't been published, therefore, I'm no good, or, feel that you're anything less than. I think the core of what makes you good as a photographer is, or successful photographer should say, is A, do you love what you do? Are you happy doing what you're doing? Are you pushing yourself creatively and having fun with it? That's the most important thing. And B, are you producing the work that you want to produce? Then, yeah, okay, you might, we at the end of the day, we do like to share our work. It's fun to see it in print. So if that is something that you like to do, put it out there, publish it, put it out in places for people to see. Now, I think that this was picked up by an agency that then sent it off to the Daily Star and a bunch of different newspapers. It was a selection of outtake photographs that were showing dogs in dippy faces, hung out and all that kind of thing. And if you have series of photographs that all connect like this, I think that's much more likely for people to want to pick up and publish, because it tells a story. People like to see things that match. That's one way you can create a series that's worth publishing. And again, this was the series of looking up shots that work so well with bracky breeds like Frenchies and pugs, and they've got the squishy little faces. They sit and look up at you. You can get that by asking them to sit and then leaning your camera over them, holding the tree over the lens, and you almost just get the head and a little bit of the body, and it is absolutely adorable. This lever is Felix. And we photographed her for the Big Issue North. They were doing an article on her because she's quite a famous cat. You might have seen, actually, she's got a book written on her. If you Google Felix the Huddersfield Station Cat, then she's out there. But she was definitely not the easiest subject to photograph. If you've ever tried photographing cats, or you have cats at home, I know Carol has cats at home, and you'll know that they're a little more on the tricky side to photograph than perhaps a dog. So with a cat, it's more on their terms. With Felix, she lives at the station, and we were following her around, waiting for her to come into the area we wanted her to be. So I wanted to get this photograph of her with the station behind. And it was a case of put the dreamies up onto the bench and wait for her to go there, and then waggle a little piece of a toy or whatever it was we had in front of the lens to get her attention this way. She actually buggered off for about an hour in the middle of this shoot, and we had to just wait around for her to come back. But she's, you know, she had people like students were coming up taking pictures of her, people getting off the train, like, oh, that's Felix Huddersfield station car. So yeah, I felt like I was in the presence of someone great. This was the first publication that we had with Lancashire Life. That was actually just after I'd placed in the Dog Photographer of the Year Awards in 2014. Something to bear in mind when you're talking to publishers of any kind is careful what you say, because they do have a tendency to mince your words. So this in this interview, I had said to them that they were asking about, you know, some of our adventures on shoots and crazy things that happened, and I said, well, Michael did quite recently get pulled into this massive pile of mud. He was, you know, right up to the top of his wellies. Fortunately, he didn't get stuck. Him and the dog got out, but you know, we'd have had to call the fire and rescue had they got stuck. And when the publication came through, they put, the end result was Michael knee-deep in the sinking mud and requiring the help of fire and rescue to get him free. So bear in mind, don't believe everything you read. This article came about from us talking to Lomography at the photography show. If you guys have ever been to the photography show, you'll know it's a fantastic event where there's all sorts of vendors, photographers. It's a really good way to network. So if you want to see your work out there, a really good way is to make connections with people, talk to people about what you do, and see if you can find some common interest. For these guys, let me tell you about this actually. They had this lens. Okay, so it's called the Petzval 58. And they were using this article as a way to promote this. And I told them about the work that we did and that we used this lens in our work. And that was how this article came about. And this lens is amazing, by the way. It's a remake of like an 1800s lens. Rather than having a focus ring, you have this little dial here to use that to focus. And rather than an aperture, you have like an aperture ring. You have aperture plates, just like these here. And they just come out and you pop them in here. And that's how you change your aperture. So it's a really fun lens to work with. And it creates this really unique swirl, which you can just create by moving this ring here. It's not the easiest lens to use with wiggly subjects like dogs. So if you want to do experimental stuff with manual focus, then I recommend choosing dogs that are slightly more on the still side. But it can be done with action. I have got an action shot with the dog just down here. So never say never. But so that came about from us talking and showing an interest in this lens. And, you know, this article was back in, I think, 2016, 17, maybe. And I really should get it out again because it's a fun lens to play with. We've had a few features in Dogs Today magazine. This is a couple of them just here. Again, that's through people just being aware of who we are and being connected. Speaking to people, knowing people always helps. And social media as well, I attribute to a lot of being able to be out there. So we've got a few more articles here from the Daily Telegraph, Express, Daily Mail, and the Times, using those series again. There was a flower series I did here. The looking up ones have been picked up on those Dippy Dogs photos. If you'd like to see more of us shooting behind the scenes, I did do a masterclass this summer with Wex in conjunction with Canon, which if you just type Wex CatsDog, then that'll come up if you pop that in Google. This again came about from, I do lives on my Instagram dishing out dog photography tips. And I think that they had seen this and reached out to me as a consequence. So the power of social media is just incredible. It allows us to reach out to loads of people all over the world. In fact, that's probably how you guys found out about me. So very much a pro for socials. And speaking of socials, we had a little share on Unilad as well. So do I think these things are important? I mean, not really. It's nice to have, but I don't feel like it defines you as a photographer. And it's all these things together as well, like lots of things. So having one thing like, okay, so you can pay a certain amount of attention to it and you can aim towards it, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think it's something that, yes, try and have, but don't stress about it. It's like having followers on Facebook, yeah, or Instagram or whatever. It has some weight and has some kudos, but then your work has to be good. What you do has to be good. The core of what you do has to come before all these extra things. And they're then things you can just add in, accessorize with as well as you go along. This in like little video we did with that's Lancashire TV, local TV station, came off the back of the first award that I won with the Dog Photographer of the Year Awards and the Kennel Club, which brings me on to this page, awards. I've won a few awards and I do really enjoy it. But again, I always feel like it's important to hedge that with, it's not the be all and the end all. Like your success as a photographer and as a creative doesn't hinge on having awards. People be interested to an extent, but they don't really care. They care whether your work's good, whether they like you and what you do is the most important thing. But if you would like to win awards, and let's face it, it's nice for us, we enjoy it, right? Then I recently was a judge for the Pet Photographers Club in the International Pet Photographer of the Year Awards, along with a couple of other pet photography competitions. And that's really given me another insight into what makes an award-winning photograph. So when you're entering a photograph and you look back at stuff that's won before, stuff that's placed before, don't enter something that matches in with that. Enter something that's different. Enter something that's uniquely you and offers something that they haven't seen before. I know certainly when it came down to the top 100 with these images, the talent was amazing. It was so blown away. And I was like, oh my God, how do I choose? So I was really looking for small imperfections that would allow me to give one image more points over another. So for example, a little bit of a distraction in the background that perhaps could have been photoshopped out. Perhaps like the sharpness wasn't bob on the eye, or maybe the masking wasn't quite as on point as it could be. And they might be very, very small infractions, but when you're getting to those final selection, they're the things that matter. So I think attention to detail is super, super important. Being authentically you and being different as well, bring something to the table that hasn't been brought before, rather than trying to reproduce stuff that you've seen before you. Alrighty, working with dogs. How do we do it? These photos here are some I've taken of Michael, usually when I'm testing the camera. And I've actually got a really good collection now of Michael calls it my stalker folder, because I'll never delete pictures when he's in it. And I'm like, well, look, now they're useful. They're showing a demonstration of what we do behind the scenes. The most important thing when you're working with dogs is to keep a nice, calm energy. I struggle with this to this day. As you might have noticed, I'm quite a wow there person. And as soon as I see a dog, I'm like, doggies. And Michael's always like, calm energy. We're going to chalk and cheese like that. But it is important. I'm always trying to rein myself in. So when I approach a dog, I avoid smiling at them. I try not to make eye contact until I've really assessed how confident they are. Some dogs are fine with new people. Some people might find it a little bit intimidating, especially when you've got a big shiny box and a light and lots of bags and stuff. So I'll very often just squat down next to them and just offer a hand out. If they're backing off, then I'll keep my hand in. You don't want to be like, if they're backing off, oh, come and take my hand. It's more of a, hi, do you want to say hi? And if they don't, that's fine. If they come up to you, then you can say hi, and then you can stroke and interact with them. But it's just making sure that first impressions count, right? It's making sure that first interaction is positive. When you're working with them, start out with lower value toys and treats, and then work your way up to the more valuable stuff. So, for example, if you've got a box of biscuits, you've got a box of chicken, start out with the biscuits. And then once you start to lose interest in that, then move on to the chicken. Because if you've been giving them treats of chicken all through the session, and then you're like, oh, I've run out of chicken, now we'll move on to the biscuits, they're going to look at the biscuits and be like, hey, hang on, where's that chicken? Give me the chicken. So start out with the lower value and move up to the higher value. And break those bits of food into small pieces so that they go much further, and so that the dog wants to keep working for them. Ask anybody else that's working with you to do the same, so that excitement level is kept up there, and like, oh, I want more, 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 more. And it allows you to shoot for longer. Give them the reward, so it might be the toy or the treat, and then take it out of sight so that it's exciting when it comes out again. So if you've given them the ball to play with, or you've had a little tug on the rope with them, then don't leave it on the ground so they can see it, and it's not exciting when it comes out. Stick it in your pocket, put it behind, give it to someone to pop in a bag, so that then when you're doing your next photo, when you're asking them to do the next thing, you can bring it out as a fresh reward again. Save running shots towards the end where you can, because even if you've got dogs that can run and run and run and run and run forever, they will still have tiredness in their face when they've been running. Dogs don't sweat like we do. They lose a lot of the heat through the mouth. So once they've started running, they start going like, and that's not a good look for anybody. So if you can, save those towards the end. That said, sometimes a small run at the very start can be helpful to just get them confident in front of the camera and build up a rapport with you. But try and keep that minimal so that you're not overexerting them. If it's not your dog that you're shooting, like I said before, get down to dog level with them and avoid leaning over them. So for us, if we smile, we lean and we go, oh, hi, how are you? We count that as friendly behavior. Whereas for a dog, if you like lean forwards and go, hi, then they see that as you're growling at them, showing teeth, bone teeth threatening, wide eyes are also threatening, and leaning down, that's a threatening body language for canines. So bear that in mind, that they speak a slightly different language to us. So just keep rein it in, let them approach you. And if they don't, then just give it a minute before, pushing. Don't push them, let them come to you, basically. Put treats in all your pockets. And like I have a little pouch when I'm shooting, I have them in there, in pockets. Michael has them in pockets. My clients usually have them as well. So treats are at the ready whenever they do something that you want. They'll then know that, okay, when I do whatever they're asking, I get rewarded, and they'll be more inclined to do it as you go on. Shortly after meeting them, but before you actually go and set up the shot, give them a command, like ask them to sit, and then give them the reward, so that they know that, oh, okay, so when this person asks me to do this, I get a reward. Again, it's just starting to build that relationship with them. Help them to dissociate from anything they might be nervous of, like the flash or the camera click, by randomly setting it off as you're walking from your spot, like from the car or wherever you met up, to the spot where you're going to shoot. Set it off when they're looking, set it off when they're not looking, so that they don't think it's something that they're doing. They're just like, oh, well, there's just these clicks going off, there's just flashes going off. It's not a big deal. And that can be done, like I said, when you're walking between spots, when you're going between one spot you're shooting at to the next. Or it can be done like when you stopped talking to the client or the pet parent, whoever it is that you're working with. And then they're not going to think it's because, oh, I'm doing this, and then a click's happening or a flash is happening. We usually start shooting without the flash, so we'll do some natural light photos to get them used to the concept of what we're doing. I usually start on a long lens, 70 to 200, so I can come back from the dog and then gradually work closer and introduce the flash as we go on. So it's just building up their confidence gradually. Trying to reward them with food every time that you, or a toy every time that you click or every time you flash, can actually have the opposite effect to building their confidence. It can actually knock their confidence and build a negative association, because they're thinking, oh gosh, every time I take this treat, then a flash is going off or a click's going off, and that can make them not want to take the treat, and thus then not to be able to be rewarded because they think something bad's going to happen. So just be very, very careful about the message you're putting across. It's really the way dogs speak and the way they think. It's simplified really, and it's very logical and makes sense when you think about it, but it's not like we tend to go about ways in slightly different things. So try and take it from their perspective and speak dog as much as you can. I see a lot of photographers showing them the gear. So they're like, oh, look at this camera. Oh, wow. And then the dog are like, oh God, what's this box being shoved in my face? And it can put them off from the off go. You don't need to do that. You can just pop it down on the ground if it's safe to do so, and just let them explore it. You can stand near them whilst the flash or the camera is in your hand. And again, just let them just see it. You don't need to actually pick it up and show it to them. And if you're just stood around talking with the equipment in your hands, they'll get used to just being a part of you and be like, yeah, no big deal. Yeah, and as they then, if you get the treat out and then ask them to approach you and you're sat next to the gear, then they'll be approaching the gear because they're coming to you for the treat without really thinking about it. So you just sit down next to your flash or your camera and then call them over, give them the treat. Then they're coming close to the gear without you being like, oh, look, come to the gear specifically. They're coming to you and to the treat, but coming to the gear as an aside to that. Keep them on the lead throughout the shoot. This gives you so much more control. It keeps the dog safe, and it just makes the whole thing so much smoother. You can always take a reference photo. I call them blank shots, where you can ask the human and the dog to come behind you while you take the same photo, lock your settings, take that same photo, and then you can Photoshop all that out afterwards. I've got some before and after showing the original shot as it came out of camera and the edited shot coming up in a bit. So you can see how I approach that. Reward the dog when they do something that you've asked. So if you ask them to sit and they've sat at a slight angle or maybe a bit too far forward, not quite where you wanted, still gives them that treat, because they don't know that they haven't sat in the right position. All they know is you said sit. They didn't know that you meant, I want you to sit right along the edge of this rock, please. They just said, well, I think we said sit. So give them the treat and then reposition them and try again. If you don't reward them when they sit because it was not where you wanted them to sit, then they won't realize that they're going to get a treat for sitting. They'll just think, well, sometimes you give me a treat, sometimes you're not. So I'm not working for you. Dogs are smart and they will pay more attention if their treat's been broken, because they know as it's been broken, it's then going to be given to them. They know if your hand's going into the bag, it's going to come out and then they're going to get a treat. So rather than just sort of standing there being like, oh, look at me, look at me, look at me, and then giving them the treat, act like get someone to hold the treat above your lens and break it and slowly go and give it to them, or slowly going into the bag, so that like, okay, so I know that the treat's coming because the human is making those actions that happen before the treats come to me. Make sure you treat them regularly, but not so often, like not too often, but not so little that they get fed up. The timing's really different depending on the dog. So some you can ask to wait a little bit longer before you give them the treat, or, if they're being restrained on the lead, some of them will keep their interest, they'll keep looking without the treat actually going to them for longer than others. And you really need to do that as a case-by-case scenario. If they break their sit or lose interest, then you probably waited too long before rewarding them. And if they do break that command, don't give them the treat after, because then you're basically rewarding them for stopping. So if you ask them to sit, they sit, and then they stand up. Don't give them the treat, because you're actually rewarding them for standing up, and they'll get confused. It's actually harder than it sounds to do this. So if you have a dog at home, catch yourself if you're doing this. I'm guilty of doing this occasionally as well. We all do it. It's something to be mindful of. One of the best ways to get dogs, or a lot of dogs' attention, is noisemakers. And in my hand, in the picture here, I've got a rabbit call and a bird whistle. They make all sorts of crazy sounds. The hunting whistles that Acme do are really cool because they make animal-like sounds. Dogs absolutely love them. You can also use like the whizzy lips you get in party bags, that kind of thing. You can get apps on your phone that make noises. You can make noises with your mouth. One of the noises I love to make is all the way up there. So the pitch is changing. They love this because the tone's changing so much, and it makes them tilt the head from side to side, which gets those gorgeous, like cute head tilt photos. Be aware that nervy dogs will be less into noise. So try softer, more subtle sounds, or you might not even want to use a noise if it's a nervy dog. Michael's very good. I mean, I call Michael my dog whisperer. He's very good at reading dog's body language, and like, cat, don't make noises with this dog. You can just tell if they're a little bit nervous. And things to look out for with nervous dogs, as I mentioned before, like ears back, head down, like a kind of like a more withdrawn body posture. And some dogs can seem super confident, but the noises can then be the reason they're turning away from the camera. So they might be all dead happy, but then they don't like those loud noises. So then they're like looking away because they're like, every time I look at this camera, she's blowing a really loud noise. No thanks. So don't, just because they're confident, don't just go in there with the loudest noises. Start quieter and then build your way up. If they're not one for noises, you can try dropping things just in front of the lens. So you can have a little stone or something and just drop it. And as it goes past your lens, their eye contact's going to look down and you can get that shot. If you're shooting on a longer lens, you can have somebody throwing balls or toys behind you, and that's just going to get them looking towards the camera. Ask a member of the dog's party to walk away, and then they'll be watching them. So if you have somebody holding the dog on the lead, you're there with your camera, and the party, the dog's humans walking away behind you, they're going to be like, oh, where's my mom going? And watching and thus looking at you because they're right behind you. Before you get a dog in the scenario, test your camera settings and your general crop. So don't try and get their attention whilst you're getting the settings, because you're just going to be wasting their energy, wasting their attention. And it's going to be harder then when you do want to work with them. If you want to test your settings, make sure exposure's right, test it on their backside or, a side of them that's the same color as their face. And you can test the light on that part of them rather than getting their attention, and let everybody else that's involved know that that's what you're doing. Because if they see your head behind the camera, they might just think, oh, right, okay, so she's shooting now. We'd best get the attention. But if you say, I'm just getting my settings, you don't need to do anything, Fido can chill, and then tell them when you're ready. Be aware that for most dogs, when you call their name, that's going to make them come to you. Our natural instinct, I think, sometimes is to be behind the lens and then be like, oh, Poppy, Poppy. And then they're going to think, oh, cool, I'm being called over, and run over to you. But it might be you wanted them to stay sat in that beautiful patch of flowers rather than come over to you. So using these other methods like noises, squeakers, whistles, voice, whatever, that's a better way to get their attention than using their noise. And ask whoever's present not to make noises as well. This is something that you'd think would be easy, but I'd say on all the sessions we have to ask several times, because the people that we're photographing for obviously want the really good photos of the dog. They want to be helpful, so they're often behind me, like saying the dog's name or making noises, and I'm like, it's all right, you don't need to say anything, because if you're making a noise, they're going to be looking up at you. But sometimes you have to remind people of this a few times because they're trying to be helpful, and that can just be distracting. You want to make sure you're the only person making noises. So preempt that, and then just remind them if they do make a noise. Putting the dogs on a raised surface, as I mentioned earlier, is a really good way to anchor them in position. It can be a really good way to cut out any crap in the background. You can also make it less stressful for the dog if they're trying to run off everywhere. It just keeps them in that one spot. I found this technique really good for a puppy series that I did, where I photographed dogs that were under, I think they were between 4 and 6 weeks old. So they hadn't had the jabs yet. They couldn't go out and about, but I wanted to get these photos of them outside with the big sky. So I disinfected my car roof and put them on top of that, and then got them looking down the camera. As you can see here, gorgeous little Bella. Oh, and another little tip that actually isn't on this slide, but this has just reminded me, is to get peanut butter and pop it on their nose, and then that gets them licking it off. So that's what we've done with Bella here. We popped peanut butter on her nose, and then her tongue's out because she's been licking her nose, and then just have that shutter on like so that you can get that moment. Not every shot's going to work with every dog, but if you do shots in a certain order, then that can get them more comfortable. So, for example, these wide angle flash shots, or the shots where I'm like leaning over and the dog sat up looking at me, I usually can't start with, because it's very in their face. If you start further away and then work up towards those shots, then that is more likely to be more comfortable for the dog. But above all else, always put the dog's safety first. Remember, you can always edit out the bits that you don't want afterwards, like leads, human elements, distractions in the background, like I've done here. I've got a few before and afters just coming up to demonstrate how my photographs come out straight out of camera, and then the finished article. This little guy, Alfie here, was on his lead and being held by the camera. Michael's just here holding the treat right in front of my lens. So he's looking down towards me. I've taken that reference photo and then just shopped it out. This is Bubblina in Prague, just in front of the Charles Bridge, behind her there on a beautiful sunny morning. One great thing as well about taking these blank photos, these extra plates, reference photos, whatever you want to call them, they get other elements that you can then sew into your photograph. So with the blank shots that I took without Bubblina and without her human in, there were more ducks and swans just over here. So I've kept them in this element, but then I've taken out the human, the lead, and then I've taken out this little bit of tree as well. Usually I try and get the dog's lead behind them, but because of the size difference, we've got a Daxi and an Akita here. Because of the size difference, if the Daxi was behind the Akita, so the lead was behind the Akita, the dog just wouldn't be visible because he's so little. And also you want to make sure that their eyes are in the same level. So because I'm at I think 2.8 here. So if he was stood behind and the Akita's in front, both of their eyes aren't going to be in focus. So you want to try and make sure they're on the same focus plane. But again, we've got human element, Michael here on the lead, keeping them safe. My client's holding the light, and I know I can take those out after. It was a very busy pathway that, I'm surprised I didn't have to Photoshop any people out. It's at Avon Park. That avenue always seems crammed with people. But it looks like we waited for a moment there when it was clear. Again, shooting to the side to extend the canvas just over here. So you can see here, the original frame was more in this area here. And then I've taken an extra shot here, which has just allowed me to extend that negative space to the left here and take out little bits of grass I didn't want in there. Back upon Malham Cove, it's not as much of a drop as it looks just behind Bowie there, but again, it's an uneven surface. So we kept him on the lead so that he's kept safe and he's not running off, falling down any cracks or anything like that. And then taking that reference photo just to shop out Michael and the lead, etc. So that's photographing dogs. What about other animals? We mainly photograph dogs, and that's what our business revolves around. But we have photographed chickens, horses, cats, and a pig more recently. So with cats, as I mentioned before, it's more on their terms. It's waiting for them to come into the scenario. And on this one, we actually had turned up to the shoot to photograph 6 toy poodles. And the lady, it was in this lady's gorgeous like landscaped garden, and she had a little cat, and he was just following us around on the shoot, and he got into the tree. He got in the tree when I was photographing the dogs underneath the tree. I thought there's a moment there. So it's just being ready with cats, being spontaneous, and I guess creating interest. So we'd created interest unknowingly by messing around with the dogs under the tree, and he'd come to investigate. So putting something they're interested in, a toy or a dreamy treat, something like that, to lure them into the spot you want them in and encourage them to be where you want can help. A box. Cats love getting inside things. So popping a box in the spot you want to shoot them in can also help to bring them into the spot as well. Pigs are like photographing very stubborn dogs, like really stubborn, strong dogs, very short attention span. And just, yeah, you've got to be very on the ball with rewarding them quickly, else they're just going to lose interest and get bored. This little guy, he lives up in Bispam. He has a set walk that he's allowed to walk with his human. He lives in the house and acts, he lives with the dog and acts like a dog basically, but he has a much more strong-willed. And by the end of the session, he had a full-on tantrum. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So we had to call it a day. So you've got a much smaller window of time when you're working with pigs. I haven't actually edited this photograph yet. This is more or less straight out of camera. So you're getting a sneak peek of it there. It will be coming to my Instagram soon. So how have all these clients ended up sitting down in front of my lens? A lot of it has been from doing exhibitions and social media as well. But exhibitions was how I started out generating work. I would go to dog shows. I would go to agricultural shows. I'd go to like craft fairs. I'd just be everywhere basically. And if you're going to do a show, it's a really good idea to have a strong show offer. but make sure that it also fits into your model. So when I was doing the volume model, I would include a free photograph with the session that they could buy there. But we moved away from that because even though it's based on an average when you're working that model, and you'll get some heroes and some zeros. So some people that will want to invest in the artwork and will value it, and some people that are just showing up for the free image. That's fine if that's a model that you're working with. It was very successful. I had a great run with it, but it just started to crush me when we were serving people that just didn't really value our work. So now we've moved it towards including, when we have a show offer, we include £50 wall art credit as opposed to an actual image, so that they know they've got a chunk of money to put towards something. So they know that there's going to be an investment further down the line when they come to view their photographs. Doing dog shows is also a really good way of actually being at dog shows and photographing people's dogs and letting them know about you, getting them to follow you and engage with you on social media, being present on social media. It's all very well having a social media, but if you're not posting content that's interesting and engaging for them, they're not going to remember you or follow you. So just being out there, putting yourself out there and reminding people that you exist basically is key. So towards bringing back to the end of, or the present day of my professional career, we now do workshops, which we started in January 2020, pre-lockdown. Doesn't that feel like everything just started pre-lockdown? We are running some again next year. We've got one in Italy and we've got one coming up in America. And there's a good chance we'll be doing one in the UK as well. It's not officially organized yet, but if you're interested in learning directly from us in an in-person workshop, then go to catsdog.co.uk and just click on the workshops tab UK and pop your email address in there, and you'll be the first to be notified when we announce we're doing a workshop. You can also hang out with me on social media, and I would absolutely love you to, particularly Instagram. I'm very active over there, and Facebook. But I do weekly lives every Tuesday, usually around 5 p.m. I go live and I dish out dog photography tips. So if there's anything you would like me to cover in one of them, feel free to send me a message, and I'll pop that on my list. And I love chatting to you guys on that platform. So I would love for you to join me if you're an Instagrammer or a Facebooker. Thank you so much for having me.